Imagine a scenario, if you will. You and your two friends meet a man who tells you to look under a tree where you will discover something amazing. The three of you look under the tree and lo and behold, there is a hole full of gold coins. You decide to split the money equally between you. One of your friends volunteers to go home and get some wine to celebrate. Whilst he's away, your other friend suggests that rather than split the money 3 ways, you two should kill your friend when he returns and then end up with a bigger share of the money. What do? Do you refuse and take your third of the money and go off to live a happy life? Or do you agree to the plan, murder your friend and get more of the loot? The murder option is risky. What's to say your friend won't turn on you too? But would it be better to have half of the money instead of just a third? Hopefully, the right answer is obvious. We should, of course, take the third of the gold and stay well clear of murder. We know without too much thought what would be the right thing to do, because as humans we have been intrinsically programmed with a moral code which determines right from wrong. To put it simply, most people are taught from birth that being a good person is better than being a bad person. However, is morality quite as simple as that? Is morality indeed universal, or is it relative? Are moral virtues right or wrong only within the context of a certain standpoint? In this talk, I want to explore the role that literature has had and continues to have in the promotion or subversion of a moral code. I'm going to attempt to chart the different stages of moral exemplification in literary texts and come to a conclusion about when, how and why literature's relationship with binary notions of good and evil changes. The example I began with is a pared-down version of the Pardoner's Tale by Geoffrey Chaucer, taken from the Canterbury Tales. In the story, the 3 young men believe that they are more powerful than death. The old man instructs them to find death under the tree, where, instead, they find the gold. The 2 friends do decide to kill the third, but, unsurprisingly, friend number 2 gets murdered as well. The final twist is that the one who now has all the money drinks the wine to celebrate, only to discover that his friend had poisoned it, intending to kill him. Everyone dies because no one is more powerful than death. Now, if we all know that murder is wrong, and that the moral decision is to take the money and go, why is it that Chaucer needs to include the second half of the story? Quite simply, the moral message might not be strong enough, were it not for the fact that we see the disastrous consequences of making the wrong decision. In order to promote morality, we have to see the outcome of taking the immoral path. The Pardoner's Tale is generically part of a long literary tradition of stories whose aim is to share a moral message. Throughout the Middle Ages, art and literature had been fundamentally influenced by religion and by religious ideals of virtue and vice. A prevalent feature of medieval churches, doom paintings were a visual depiction of the joys of rising to heaven, as pitted against the eternal torments of the damned, swallowed by the hell-mouth and persecuted by demons. At a time when the majority of churchgoers would have been illiterate, the church needed to stage regular visual manifestations of positive moral and religious attributes in order to maintain control of potentially deviant subjects. In this period, mystery plays became a verbal equivalent of doom paintings, serving as a warning about the dangers of a life of sin. Written and performed in annual cycles, mystery plays usually represented biblical subjects. They developed from plays presented in Latin by churchmen on church premises, and depicted such subjects as the creation, Adam and Eve, the murder of Abel, and the Last Judgment, all stories where the moral of doing the right thing is reiterated through an exemplification of what happens when you do the wrong thing. However, perhaps inevitably, the performative nature of the pieces began to dilute the religious message. People got carried away with the entertainment side of the process. During the 13th century, various guilds began producing these mystery plays in the vernacular at sites removed from the churches. Under these conditions, the strictly religious nature of the plays declined, and they became filled with irrelevancies and apocryphal elements. At this stage, medieval morality plays began to develop. These allegorical dramas were popular in Europe, especially during the 15th and 16th centuries, and depicted characters who personified moral qualities, such as charity or vice, and in which moral lessons were taught. The action of the morality play centred on a hero, such as mankind or everyman, whose inherent weaknesses were assaulted by such personified diabolical forces as the 7 deadly sins, but who chose redemption and enlisted the aid of such figures as the 4 daughters of God: mercy, justice, temperance, and truth. John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, written later in 1678, is similarly very much in line with this type of moral and religious allegory, although it was much more popular than its predecessors, as it transformed the simplistic moral fables of the mystery and morality plays into something which more closely resembles the modern novel format. The entire book is presented as a dream sequence, narrated by an omniscient narrator. The allegory's protagonist, Christian, is an everyman character, and the plot centres on his journey from his hometown, the city of destruction, this world, to the celestial city, that which is to come, i.e. heaven, which is atop Mount Zion. Christian is weighed down by a great burden, the knowledge of his sin, which he believed came from his reading the book in his hand, i.e. the Bible. This burden, which would cause him to sink into hell, is so unbearable that Christian must seek deliverance. He meets Evangelist as he's walking out in the fields, who directs him to the wicket gate for deliverance. Along the way, Christian encounters a number of characters who attempt to hinder him and stop him from reaching the celestial city. Christian has a rough time of it because of his past sins wearing him down, but he's finally welcomed into the celestial city at the end. So, whilst the moral message of these texts remains clear, life is hard and full of temptations, but be good and moral and you'll succeed, it could be argued that the literary embellishments of plot and the more rounded characterisation of antagonists on these moral journeys was beginning to become more engaging to readers than the moral message itself. This is indeed the fundamental risk of religious or moralistic writing, that the antithesis of morality becomes so appealing that it could potentially destabilise our view of morality itself, something also inevitably influenced by the wider social support of these moral edicts. When Bunyan is writing, as in the Middle Ages and the medieval period, the Zeitgeist was predominantly religious in nature. However, in the 18th and 19th centuries, this began to shift, and so too did the perception of morality. The Enlightenment positioned moral responsibility with the individual rather than the church, and the advent of Darwinism and anthropology in the 19th century recalibrated morality as an almost zoological function required to protect human evolution. In the world of literature, these shifts happened too, and a more ambiguous representation of morality became the norm. Looking to the 19th century, on the one hand, texts such as A Christmas Carol offer a recognisable advocation of goodness. Scrooge's transformation from miserly misanthropist to redeemed philanthropist is clearly held up as an exhortation to readers to change their ways and care more about social injustice and inequality. We are in no doubt once we've read the book that to be good is to be better. However, on the other hand, we have texts such as Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House, where the notion of goodness is challenged and undermined. Ibsen's play is hailed as the first work of dramatic realism, and I think this is key to our understanding of what's happening in terms of morality. Written in 1879 in Norway, A Doll's House is the first play to show real people in real domestic situations. Before this, drama had been farcical or melodramatic and had borne little resemblance to the lives of audience members. In contrast, Ibsen's play, although imbued with layers of symbolism, is nevertheless naturalistic in style. In the play, middle-class housewife Nora Helmer forges her father's signature to borrow money in order to save her husband, Torvald's health. Women's ownership of money was illegal at the time, so Nora attempts to keep her debt and repayments a secret from her husband. She's threatened with exposure by the man from whom she borrowed the money, as he believes her to have encouraged her husband to sack him from his job. Nora places her trust in the idea that if the story comes out, a miracle will occur in which her husband, Torvald, will take responsibility for her crime and she will be able to deny him that opportunity. However, when Torvald initially discovers what she has done, he turns on her for ruining his life, tarnishing his reputation, and poisoning their children with her deceit. It's only when Nora's IOU note is returned that Torvald brings himself to forgive her. Unable to live with Torvald any longer, Nora leaves her home, her family, and her children. Now, in moral terms, nothing here is clear-cut. Firstly, Nora's bad actions, the borrowing of the money and the subsequent hiding of the truth, were done for good reasons. The morality of her actions is ambiguous. The patriarchal society in which Nora operates would have considered this to be immoral, far from the angel in the house model promoted to women. Yet, in our 21st century position, we might consider the restriction of women's fiscal freedoms to have been immoral in the first place. Secondly, Nora's abandonment of her children, definitely something which would have been considered bad and immoral, was done to protect Nora herself. Her need to escape what we would now define as a toxic marital situation, whilst not good, is certainly not immoral. So, by the 19th century, literature, like society, was losing its binary moral oppositions of good and bad. Arguably, though, the turning point after which this shift became irreversible was the World Wars. In the first half of the 20th century, during times of war, it quickly became apparent that goodness was not necessarily triumphant anymore. The need to be a good person seemed incongruous at a time when hundreds of thousands of good people on both sides lost their lives, having done nothing wrong. War was not immoral, it was amoral. It had no concept of or concern for the moral codes upon which humans had based their existence for centuries. In the history of literature, the impact of war replaced naturalistic and realistic literature with texts that are what is now referred to as modernist in style. Modernism sought to break with the past and search for new forms of expression. It fostered a period of experimentation in the arts from the late 19th to the mid-20th century, particularly in the years following World War I. In an era characterised by industrialisation, rapid social change, and advances in science and the social sciences, modernists felt a growing alienation incompatible with Victorian morality, optimism, and convention. The enormity of the war had undermined humankind's faith in the foundations of Western society and culture, and post-war modernist literature reflected a sense of disillusionment and fragmentation. Modernist texts overturned the apple cart of what was considered to be good, both in terms of characters' moral behaviour and literary form itself. At the same time, composers including Arnold Schoenberg, Igor Stravinsky and Anton Webern sought new solutions within new forms and used as yet untried musical approaches to tonality. In dance, a rebellion against both balletic and interpretative traditions had its roots in the work of Émile Jacques Delcroze, Rudolf Laban and Louis Fuller. In art, painters such as Edouard Manet broke away from inherited notions of perspective, modelling and subject matter, instead increasingly focusing on the intrinsic qualities of their media, like line, form and colour, and moving away from inherited notions of art. In this way, with the advent of modernism, there seemed to be a deliberate desire to celebrate those ideals, beliefs and techniques which had previously been considered to be bad or immoral. In many ways, literature hasn't really looked back since. It's fair to say that no longer do we simply celebrate the overcoming of life's trials and tribulations by fundamentally moral characters. We celebrate those whose actions hover in that liminal space on the moral scale between good and evil. Take, for example, the Dexter series of novels by Jeff Lindsay. The blurb tells us, "Meet Dexter Morgan, a polite wolf in sheep's clothing. He's handsome and charming, but something in his past has made him abide by a different set of rules. He's a serial killer whose one golden rule makes him immensely likeable. He only kills bad people." The core idea of defeating the bad guys is clearly nothing new. After all, Robin Hood's USP was that he robbed the rich to save the poor. However, there's something more unsettling and dialectically disturbing at play here. The reader knows from the start that Dexter is a serial killer. it's clear that he has a specific method of murdering people which other criminals go on to ape. One of the most clear-cut universal rules within our moral code is that murder is wrong. However, here, as one critic gushes, we are given maybe the first serial killer who unabashedly solicits our love. This requires the reader to embrace a moral shift and to question their fundamental understanding of what is right and wrong. Yes, Dexter kills bad people, but it's a different moral standpoint to be championing a vigilante approach to justice. Thus, as society has shifted away from binary views of good and evil, so literature has also developed in its presentation of characters and their moral compasses. Gone are the allegorical representations of virtue as seen in the medieval morality plays, and instead we have characters whose morality is at least ambiguous and at the most questionable. In a world where immorality or amorality appears to lead to personal and social success, it's unlikely that there will be a shift away from this moral ambivalence in both literature and the world anytime soon.